So thanks again, everyone, for joining. It's really nice to see another really good turnout.
So today our first speaker is Tom Duncan, who's been working as a project officer with First Nations Adapt, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada for several years. He was born in Calgary, but has worked in Ottawa for the last while. Working in adaptation and supporting community resilience has been challenging, but also rewarding. So very happy to have Tom here today to share a bit more on the program that he's been working on with CERNAC, the First Nations Adapt program. So there'll be time for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free if you want to add them to the chat box kind of as they occur to you, that's fine, and we can come back and visit them at the end of the presentation. So you should all be able to see Tom's screen now. Tom, if you just want to put it into presentation mode so we can see the larger view, if that works for you.
Will do. So, okay, there we go. Does that look all right?
Yeah, looks good. All right, okay. Over to you, Tom.
Super.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Catherine, and welcome everyone. Thanks for having me today present on the First Nation Adapt program. I am sitting in for Christiane Palou, who's our manager, who was unfortunately away today, so I'm up to attempt to talk about our program. I've done this a few times, so I should be able to get through it all right. And if you have any questions later, I'd be more than happy to answer those. Yeah, I've been with the group for several years. I'm a project officer. I deal particularly with BC and the Atlantic provinces, but our overall program deals with all First Nations south of 60, essentially. So we have people that represent Alberta and other provinces, but I'm particularly dealing with those coastal regions. Yeah, so we deal with First Nation communities and are considering those communities when we are reviewing project proposals. I'll talk very quickly, I guess, about our details of our program in terms of the fact that we are dealing particularly with adaptation, but we deal both with sort of general adaptation projects, but we also deal with flood mapping projects in particular. First Nation Adapt supports the adaptation cycle from initiation to assessments to cost-benefit analysis. So we sort of cover the range. We're only dealing with those areas of work that deal with soft studies. We don't actually build infrastructure. So we lead projects or communities into the world of adaptation, try to get them started, and work towards more sophisticated studies as communities move into that world of understanding better and better what their climate change impacts look like. We've been supporting a holistic range of community-led measures in the provinces, as I mentioned. And since 2016, our program was initiated. We've been working directly with First Nation communities, as well as organizations, First Nation organizations, to build capacity and address local concerns. The program, as I said, deals particularly with communities and understanding what those communities' concerns are. We really want to be working with communities to ensure that our program is responsive to those community concerns. I mentioned earlier, we kind of deal with a range of types of studies. So, risk assessments, including determining what those recommendations are and what those options are that would best meet those concerns of communities. And then we could work into the cost benefit analysis area as well, once the understanding is there in terms of what those concerns are and what the different options might be. We deal with a range of different impact types, including flood mapping. We'll deal with water wildfires, drought, sea level rise, and coastal concerns, as well as erosion. So the erosion could be inland as well as coastal. And that's something we're seeing quite a bit of these days for sure. The flood mapping program was something that was actually fairly recently renewed, so we're happy about that, and we're trying to get ourselves organized. It came a bit late this year. We were expecting to get renewed earlier in the fiscal year, but unfortunately that was kind of put off somewhat. We were unsure for several months this year as to whether we were going to have those dollars, but now they're here, and so we're quickly trying to ramp up and take in as many proposals as possible right now. And but the flood mapping is just, we've had these two different pots of money, and the flood mapping was something that was set aside specifically for flood related studies. And as you can imagine, there are many areas across Canada that are experiencing flood issues, and so we're having usually no trouble spending our funds. And I should mention our budget is 9 million annually each year, and 4 of that is basically set aside for basic adaptation, and 5 million is set aside for the flood mapping. But we don't really concern ourselves about, being super strict about, the types of work we do. Yeah, and trying to spend only 5 million on flood mapping, for example. I mean, we kind of react to those types of issues that are presented to us in those proposals that we receive from First Nations. Yeah, so very quickly, our project eligibility is in terms of ensuring that we're really directing our funds towards First Nation communities and First Nation organizations. Our typical size of project, I guess, is a range between $80,000 and $160,000 per year. We can fund 1 year, or we can fund over multiple years, which is extremely handy. What happens typically is, we don't have as I mentioned at the very bottom of the slide, we don't have a call for proposals. So we get proposals in on an ongoing basis over the course of the year. And sometimes people don't get us proposals until later in the fiscal year, and consequently cannot get all their work done in that 1 year. And so it's nice to be able to overlap into the next year, subsequent years, as needed or as required by the project. But First Nation and communities for sure, and I mean, anyone we're working with certainly appreciates the fact that there is no deadline, and it gives them the flexibility to get us a proposal at any point. I mentioned earlier, we kind of talk about adaptation as a cycle of different types of works, and it kind of starts off sometimes in understanding better within the community what climate change is and what kind of work could help, to better understand what those impacts are. And we often can fund engagement sessions, for example, or community workshops. And that can lead into further work, such as understanding better, what those vulnerabilities look like and what the community's concerns are, and what, then further on into more modeling type exercises, such as hazard maps or flood maps or storm surge models, for example. But it really ranges, I guess. And so I think we want to get across to our clientele that we really do cover all the bases, and it doesn't really matter, where they're at. We'll sort of meet them at whatever level they want to start at it. And we do also, we're definitely aware of the fact there are over 600 First Nation communities across Canada, and we've only funded about 2/3 of those over, since we started. So there are several gaps in our funding, and we'd like to get to those communities that we haven't been able to work with yet. And there are a lot of reasons for that, probably, but certainly I don't think it's the case that they're not experiencing climate change. I suspect it's something else that's involved in them, not able to get, maybe they're not aware of our program, or they haven't been able to get proposals developed. Here's a few very quick examples of some of the works we've been involved in over the last few years. On the West Coast, we funded the New Charlotte Tribal Council on a large project actually that involves several communities on the West Coast called the Coastal Vulnerability Study. We co-funded that program with our colleagues within Indigenous services, and so that's been going on. It's still going on. We're trying to get all 60 coastal First Nations assessed. It's really more of a hazard assessment, looking at sea level rise, storm surge, and tsunami modeling, and to see what the water inundation potential looks like. And you can see there's Sikine First Nation. There's a Winnipeg River shoreline assessment going on there. It mentions the Sagicol Lake First Nations in Ontario, where it reminds me that one of the impact areas I guess we want to mention is the fact that we are working with winter road issues and concerns. That's a particular concern in Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba. So just very quickly wanted to mention a few examples. This is a graphic illustration that came from one of our earlier engagement sessions. I can see it's dated way back in 2017, so this is way back in our history, but it kind of, I think, does a good job of telling the tale of the types of things we want to let people know about in terms of our program, that you really are wanting to be community led. And so if we get a call from a consulting firm, we're really more likely to say, well, let's talk to the community and get a sense of where they're coming from first before engaging too much with the consulting firm. We really want to know where the community's at, where they want to go, I guess, in terms of their adaptation work. Yeah, so this indicates a few of those impact areas, for example, that we want to look at. For example, fire and flooding, winter roads, for example, are all issues that we're aware of as being of prominent concern for First Nations. And I think one thing I hadn't really mentioned, I should mention, is the fact that we are sort of guiding these concerns and these assessments towards the infrastructure element within First Nations. And so we're definitely not able to fund health-related studies, which are of major concern for many First Nations. And also, I think we want to stay a little bit away from the biophysical element as well. So we try to guide studies towards the infrastructure asset management side of things in First Nations. But I think I'm pretty much done. I see I'm at the last slide here, and I'm not sure how my time is, but I guess I've certainly been interested in answering any questions you might have.
Thanks very much, Tom. So if anyone has questions, feel free to raise hands, put them in the chat box. I think I see a few hands popping up already. All right, the order you're appearing on my screen, I'll go to Ryan first, and then SCC Kunin, and then Lisa. So Ryan Smith, go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could just put up that second last slide with the little infographic for the health event. That'd be great. Thank you.
Sure.
If you don't mind, I was just going to take a screen grab of that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And as per usual, we will collect and circulate presentations at the end of the meeting with sort of some notes and the links that people are posting in the chat as well. Right. Go ahead, SC Kunin.
That's Sarah.
Sarah. Oh, you're Sarah Cunningham. Okay. It's like in the tiny square in the screen. It's not showing up all on my screen. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. I'm really interested in the vulnerability assessments and the criteria that I used for them. Is that a standard set of a criteria, or is it all community specific, community determined?
Really, yeah, we just leave it up to the communities to decide, how they want to set up their criteria for vulnerability assessments, I'd say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Lisa.
Hi there. I actually put it in the chat as well. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. So just you mentioned that you excluded the biophysical and immediately because I was already ready for you. What are natural assets and natural infrastructure? Is that explicitly excluded or something you might aim towards? Or
we would aim towards, and I think we really are feeling as the program evolves, that we're trying to be as responsive, I guess, to where the community is coming from. So I really don't like ever saying, oh yeah, that's never going to be funded or anything. And for sure, if it's just because it has the word natural in front of it, I don't think we're gonna not fund it. It'd be for sure natural asset management would be something, we'd be very, very interested in. I think we'd be able to rationalize that's a piece of infrastructure, and so therefore, yeah, it's more of that. Can we do a fish habitat vulnerability assessment, for example, or something like that, or an ecosystem, that would be a little bit challenging. Although one argument we often say is, well, is there anyone else who can fund this? And, the jury is often out, in terms of those questions. It takes a little bit of research on our side to try to figure out, well, is there a DFO program, for example, that could deal with that habitat issue? And there are programs out there, but often they're not necessarily, able to fund for whatever reason, at that time. And really don't want to put communities through the various government hoops, right? To find that those few dollars that exist out there. But it's just a bit of a minefield for communities to figure out where funding is coming from. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so we're just trying to, help out as much as possible. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Dan, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tom. So just a little more, I guess I have two questions. One question concerning the wildland fire work. What's the nature of that work? Is it focused on emergency management, response, and firefighting, or is it more focused on mitigation of fire risk, like fuel management in and around communities? That's one question.
Yeah, it's the latter. We can't put boots on the ground, doing that. We would do a traditional burn plan, for example, that kind of thing. We would do a vulnerability assessment on, communities' risk to future forest fire and what that risk looks like moving out over, a number of years. There's also, there is a Fire Smart program that already exists. That's quite well, I'd say it's funded through the emergency management program, and in BC anyways, and I think across Canada there's dollars identified for Fire Smart, but we would definitely fund Fire Smart type activities if it wasn't for the fact this other program already exists. So things like that to just make communities more resilient to fire in the future, essentially.
Okay, thanks. And if it's okay, one other question was, so a good portion of your budget is allocated to I assume inland flood mapping or flood mapping generally. Are there requests from the communities you work with to incorporate climate change impacts into those maps? And are you responding to those requests, or are they sort of based on the existing historical data?
Well, both, and I think we would respond to either one. I think we'd love to see projects that would be looking at modeling what the flooding impacts look like moving into the future in a number of years. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, having a minute to get off mute there. And the last question goes to Eva Jackson. Go ahead, Eva.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Eva.
One question, is there a mechanism to share with, either the communities that you list here under the successes or other ones you engage, stories of capacity building with First Nations from non-CERNAC funded projects? So for example, like work that's been done in Ontario, if there's a case study or a little profile or an assessment that's been written up that's sort of locally led and locally championed, locally delivered, is there a way to get that information to others through your network? Like, is there a way to kind of share resources and materials that way?
So it sounded like you were looking at case studies that were created that were not funded through us. Is that what you were saying?
Exactly. But I think could be replicated through people applying to your program in their own communities outside of, in my case, Ontario specifically.
Yeah, like we list our projects that have been funded on our government website. We also have the Indigenous Climate Hub website that we've helped create and support. And on that website, there are several case studies. That's about all I can think of. And however, we can be expanding that. And I think we want to be, expanding the number of projects that are mentioned and described on the Indigenous Climate Hub. We have essentially a lot more control, ironically, on, sort of what gets posted there. We need permission from those communities actually to, put projects like final reports on there. But I'm not really sure, like if we haven't funded something, oftentimes we don't obviously know, what's going on there. But like in those cases where we did fund, we would be able to post potentially get, those project reports.
Yeah, because it just strikes me that likely people want to replicate projects that have worked in other First Nations contexts. So definitely sort of like almost a triage of, these have had the most implementation happen, or these have had the most long-lasting adaptation effects. It might spur on others to replicate those. So just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thanks.
Great. Thanks everyone for your questions and comments, and thanks Tom for sharing your presentation. I really like the way your program has that flexibility, so they can start anytime and that you meet people where they're at to try and build up their capacity and walk them through the process. So potential learnings for other programs as they're getting designed.
Thanks very much.
And a bit of foreshadowing towards the end of today's meeting, we will be talking about the state of play that the Infrastructure and Buildings Working Group did. So as you're thinking of things, sort of good case studies and examples and gaps can be highlighted as we get towards the end of the meeting. So I'll turn it over to Dan now to introduce our next set of speakers.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So our next presenter is Jill Curley. Jill Curley is a specialist on the City of Calgary's climate adaptation team, where she's focused on improving the city's resilience to climate change. She's a professional biologist with education in environmental science and land use planning, and experience in risk assessment, natural infrastructure, and stormwater management. And Jill is going to be reviewing the City of Calgary's climate strategy for us today. So I'll pass it to Jill.
Yes, success.
Success.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'll just start by saying that I'm privileged to live on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The nations of the Treaty 7 region are the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, who altogether form the Siksika-Sipi Blackfoot Confederacy, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, who altogether form the Ethnica, Wichistrabi, Stoney, Nakota First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. The City of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We acknowledge all Indigenous urban Calgarians who make Calgary their home. We're sitting in a beautiful winter day in Calgary too. We had our shift from summer to winter very abruptly. And it's interesting working in climate adaptation. When you have a beautiful fall, you almost feel like, oh, I can't even enjoy it because it's the weather is so good, but we know it's so bad. So we have this disconnect in our minds. So what I'll walk through today is our new climate adaptation plan. We took the Calgary 2022 Climate Strategy Pathways to 2050 to Council in July of this year. We had some really good debate in our council sessions with our city council, and we're returning to them with our budget ask this fall with an implementation plan, so we can really get into the nitty-gritty details of what our climate adaptation work is going to look at over the next 4 years. But now I'll give you an overview of how climate adaptation was presented within Calgary's 2022 climate strategy and action plans. So I'll start by framing it that Calgary has a lot of climate hazards and impacts. We've seen a lot of things happen in the past 10 years. Sorry if you hear my dog barking. Always a delivery to the neighbors at an impromptu time. We saw the hailstorm in 2020 that caused over $1.2 billion in damage. We still have residents who are digging out and working their way back from that. There are still scars on the landscape in Calgary. We saw hot weather in 2021 that had a human toll similar to BC. We sat under the heat dome for a few days in late June, and that caused contributed somewhere between 66 to over 150 excess deaths in Calgary over that weekend. So we saw, the impacts of climate change in just the past couple of years, that this extreme weather is really starting to make itself known. So within the strategy, we looked at building climate resilience from the mitigation and the adaptation plan lens. I'll focus on the adaptation plan, where we looked at 4 themes and 10 focus areas to organize our work. Each theme represents an important part of our city that's being acted by climate change. And the focus areas describe the progress of the work that we know we need to go to build resilience in each theme area. In the 2022 climate strategy, we focused on the themes of people, built infrastructure, natural infrastructure, and water, and to look at the ways in which we're going to reduce climate risk through building resilience in these areas. When we look at the people theme, we really dug into climate resilient communities and managing the extreme weather and climate related events that we see in Calgary. We've highlighted, and I won't go through them all, these are some of the key actions that we're looking at. We understand we need to build capacity within the city. We need more people to understand what climate risk is, how it will impact them personally, and how it will really impact our vulnerable populations. We recognize that climate risk is made up of both exposure and vulnerability, and how can we best support the most vulnerable populations across the city. And the most interesting thing about climate adaptation is that it's working not just for the future and for the climate risks that are upcoming, it's working on the risks and the vulnerability experienced by people right now. So we see it as truly a win-win for populations right now and moving into the future. One of the projects I'll highlight that some of you will be aware of is the work that we've done through looking at our climate risk at a city level or at a community level within the city, where we've gone through a climate risk index process and analysis. And we've looked at the urban heat impacts in Calgary. So with these 2 pieces of information, we're getting that better idea of where we're most vulnerable to certain hazards and why it is. We've kind of followed other Canadian cities as they've gone through these processes and how we can best implement climate adaptation practices to improve outcomes, especially in these most vulnerable communities. So through the Climate Risk Index, we've been able to highlight some of the areas that are most likely to be vulnerable to climate-related impacts and where the vulnerability lies in those areas. So we can work to develop the appropriate interventions with those community members. And with the UHI mapping, this was based on some lighter surface temperature data, and it identifies some of the warmest microclimates across the city. And with this, we're able to better understand how we might target shading or cooling interventions to develop sort of cool streets or refuge areas. And of course, what we found through this map was that the warmest areas are highly paved. Places like malls, strip malls, industrial areas, There's a lot of pavements, there's a lot of waste heat from buildings, vehicles. Obviously, they're quite warm there, and some of the cooler spaces are within the green space. The water features, the rivers, some of the constructed lakes that we have in the city, and stormwater ponds. So we're working to get both of these pieces of information publicly accessible in 2023. We've got work going on with our geodatabase and spatial solutions group to be able to bring this to the public sort of realm so that they can be used to help build understanding across our academic partners and other people that we work with. One of the ways that we're putting these two tools together is within our multi-community planning process. We've developed community climate risk profiles for communities across the city based on the climate risk index, the urban heat island map, and a map of natural assets across the city. So with all of this information put together, we're creating these sort of dashboards of information for climate risk across the different communities, geographical communities in the city. So these are being paired with the planning process to inform those multi-community plans, sort of redevelopment plans, and community service projects. For example, if we're looking to design a multi-service recreation facility, for example. They've been used in some of our Main Street redevelopment projects and things like that to include information about the main climate risks in each community and how we can start to bring down some of that risk factor. The second theme I'll just talk briefly about, which is most applicable for this group, is in the built infrastructure theme area. So we look at this in kind of three main ways: climate resilient city-owned infrastructure, what we actually own, operate, manage, have the most control over building resilience in our own facilities. We look at climate resilient homes and buildings. So this is how we can affect the private realm, whether it's through development processes or through recommendations to land use bylaw changes, things that we have, some control, but a lesser extent. And then we look at climate resilient utility services, as we understand that's going to be a key driver of risk reduction going forward. But again, we don't have direct control as a city. That's more with our INVACs and our electricity and gas providers. So one of the key actions that we're going to be working on over the next couple of years is building that capacity within our own staff. The city of Calgary has a tremendous number of staff, and we're just a small group with the climate team. There's about 6 of us that work on climate adaptation. So we need to have more champions across the organization. We need to spend more time meeting with industry, meeting with consultants, working to build our knowledge collaboratively and to share what we know with our partners. So that is a key area that we're trying to formalize both within the city and without with the touch points that we have. I'll talk about, there we go. One of the pieces of climate risk and resilience that we've implemented for city projects. This mirrors the federal sort of climate lens requirements, where we're looking at larger projects that are greater than $10 million. They're going to last for more than 30 years, and they have a significant opportunity to reduce climate risk. So we've embedded in some of our policies the requirements to do these climate risk and resilience assessments for some of our major projects. And we've recommended that some of the smaller projects that don't meet all of those criteria, but maybe meet 1 or 2 of those criteria, go through a sort of a streamlined assessment with our internal team. So we've found that these have been extremely effective. We've gone through probably the 8 to 10, either completed or in process in the last sort of year, 18 months. We found them to be a really positive way to prompt project teams to think about climate risk, to get beyond, that design for now, we'll figure out the future when it comes. We've been doing them kind of in a 30 to 60% design phase, because we find that's where we can really influence change, where we can really start to see what the differences we can make by looking at climate risk at the beginning of a project or in the early phases of a project, when there's still ability to change budgets, to massage design, And we've been able to have a few successes in how we can start to get more resilience in these projects. Through the process of several workshops, we've had a selection of consultants who have supported us through these. We've had just tremendous response back on how beneficial our project teams and our sort of consulting groups have found these workshops to be. And really, if that's all that these become, is a training opportunity and a win, because we're actually talking about some of the challenges that operations and maintenance and design and facilities, all of them have something to bring into these projects. And sometimes the connections aren't made until we get people in the same room. So we found that a recent workshop, they're looking at building a bus garage and retrofitting another one. So the design of the new garage was very similar to the older garage that wasn't built very long ago, within the past 10 years or so. The retrofit to the older garage was to add solar capacity and a bit of additional infrastructure. So we got brought in from that. So when the attendees in the workshop asked, well, will the new garage have air conditioning? The answer was no, that they should be able to passively cool them by opening the bay doors at night. But the challenge that the facility users have found is that when it's really smoky and it's 35 degrees, it's been extremely difficult for the operations and maintenance folks who worked there when the garage itself is 35, sometimes getting close to 40 degrees. So we're having some significant health and safety and comfort concerns. So looking at some different ways that we can start to change the assumptions of what we need to have in our infrastructure and in our facilities, so that we do have safe and comfortable and sort of climate resilient designs for the future. The biggest challenge we're finding with these projects is how to figure out the cost benefit analysis. There are different tools, there are different ways to look at it, but trying to really tangibly determine what our return on investment or the benefits of a certain investment is going to be from a climate resilient sense, that has still been our biggest challenge. So that's something that we're working to get some answers on over the next year as well. On a similar vein, we recognize that when we're doing building condition assessments for our existing buildings, that we can do better, rather than the assumption that we would replace like with like, assuming static climate conditions. We're working with our facilities management team to incorporate climate risk and resilience components to building condition assessments, so that we're prompting our assessors to look further and to consider, what will happen if we're assuming that, this building's life is 30 years remaining, or remaining useful life. What will happen if those 30 years are looking dramatically different from the past 30 years? And what will happen to those building components? So we've started to work that into the building condition assessment checklists and tools that are being used. And the outcome of those tools are going to be built into our asset management model, so that we can better assess lifespan of building infrastructure components. Paired with that, we're doing a financial analysis for sort of the climate risk impacts to buildings, like our very specific building stock, and we're covering about 70% of our stock in our kind of most similar portfolio level buildings and facilities. So that's something that we're working on, and over the next few months, we're hoping to get some numbers out of, and so that we understand better what our gaps are and what our opportunities for adaptation might be across a building portfolio level, where our greatest sort of influence are going to lie. Our third theme is in natural infrastructure. So we've done some work over the past couple of years in valuing natural infrastructure. We've done inventory, we've created a dashboard. Again, that's something that should be publicly accessible through our open data sets in 2023. And we've kind of worked as a corporation to figure out how we might integrate natural infrastructure into asset management planning, and how it can be tied into some of our financial reporting. Right now, there's been some work around that in the unaudited section, similar to where the TCFD reporting is. So that's sort of the space that it's falling into right now. With each passing year, we're hoping to get it a little more formalized and a little more obvious. Again, there's a capacity building component to this. There's the challenge of figuring out how to incorporate something like natural assets into the actual asset management tools and processes that we use at the city. But we're seeing some really good improvements on kind of a joint understanding of what this is and what it might look like. So when I talk about this, the natural assets and natural infrastructure at the city, it's really this range of natural assets, from what's been protected to what's being built and the more engineered side of it. And we had an update to our municipal development plan in 2020, kind of right in the early days of the pandemic, in which we were able to include natural infrastructure and natural assets right within our municipal development plan, to note that we need to protect them, we need to restore them, and we need to maintain them going into the future. So we're doing some work right now with the planning teams as they look at new community development and our growth management overlay process and how this really gets presented publicly and what we require for new land areas coming in, how we can look at natural assets as not just land available for development, but how we look at them as providing ecosystem services to the city and to the communities in which they are preserved. So yeah, we looked through some of the key services: water retention, urban heat reduction, habitat, recreation, carbon storage, and the amenity values that they do provide in Calgary. And we found that they provide an annual service value of somewhere in the $2.5 billion range. So they are a tremendously large service providing resource for the city of Calgary that we haven't traditionally been measuring or monitoring in any sort of holistic manner. Our final theme I'll just mention briefly is in water, recognizing that we're going to have future impacts from river floods, stormwater flooding, and water supply and wastewater management that will all be impacted by the different risks that are associated with climate change. I won't go into these in detail, but suffice to say that there's a lot of work in flood mitigation that has happened in Calgary in the past 10 years and continues to happen. We've had higher gates put onto Glenmore Reservoir. That project was completed this year, so we have a far greater flood resilience off of the Elbow River. There are ongoing advocacy and work with the province of Alberta as they are updating their floodplain mapping and working to advocate for upstream water storage solutions. We work with our water managers upstream who have dams to manage the water levels in there to protect from sort of the spring flood risk that we do see. We're working to better update and align our land use policy and regulations for flooding, for drought management, for open space management. We're really getting better, I think, or we're trying to anyways get better at aligning our policies so that we don't have stranded pieces that don't necessarily align with best practice across the board. And we're trying to integrate climate projections into our stormwater management strategies. We recognize through a major project we had looking to develop sort of a climate projected IDF curve or curves, how the future may look for climate adjusted rainfall in the city. And it's quite different. We see a lot of really flash type storms, thunderstorms, extreme rainfall events coming in short amounts of time. And we've been able to go back and track what has been monitored and measured at our rainfall gauging stations across the city and kind of get a better idea of how often are we seeing those 1 in 50-year storm events. 4 or 5 times a year is the answer sometimes. Based on the whole geographical spread of the city, we've got quite a big area. So we're trying to build that idea of future climate projections and driving it even with what we already know that's happening. And so how we can build that better into our stormwater management strategies and policies. So that's something that's on the go. And again, 2023, we should be coming out with some new documentation in that manner. And right now we're using it as recommendations for future planning, future proofing our own infrastructure as we're building city facilities, but also as development is progressing across the city. So I'll leave that there if anyone has any questions.
Great, thank you, Jill. It's very comprehensive and impressive work from the city. Please do raise your hand or unmute yourself and we'll get to your questions. We have a question here from Alice Dixon.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks Jill, for your great presentation. I think this is the second one I'm seeing from you. Really awesome program you're leading here. So many things to ask you about and talk about, but I was wondering, similar to you having a hard time making like the business case for return on investment. So those dollar values that you had on that slide for natural assets were really interesting to me. Could you speak even just at a high level how you came to some of those?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We looked at those different services provided, and we had to pair them back to see if I can, to what we could really measure. So when we looked at flooding and water management, we actually looked at the ability of natural spaces to impound water. So it was based on LiDAR data that had been modeled across the city to understand where the sort of depressions, so almost that depressional storage. So that was a massive part of the service value, was what kind of depressional storage is there within natural assets. That reduction in urban temperature, we did some correlation between the urban heat island analysis map and some mortality and morbidity work that connects temperatures over a certain level with a certain amount of enhanced mortality rate. So we had an ability to do a bit of a correlation there. We looked at habitat value. I'm going to be fuzzy on how we got to that one. But the same kind of idea. So for each one, we looked at recreational opportunities, how many users, what they're spending, and we looked at that based on land and water. So, fishermen came in a different count, and the Bow River fly fishing industry separate from cycling and walking and things like that. I can absolutely share the full valuation report that goes through it. Carbon storage, we use the values for the different types of landscapes we have in the city and how much carbon is sequestered in those areas. And we use today's carbon pricing and future carbon pricing, the $70 per ton. And then when we looked at amenity value, it was based on kind of house pricing, home price sales in proximity to natural areas, green spaces and parks and rivers and wetlands kind of thing. So for each ecosystem service, there was a different set of valuation criteria completed.
That's amazing. And just last quick, so did you do that in-house or was it a separate project?
No, I know Twyla's on the call, Associate Engineering, did a lot of work in Green Analytics. Amy Taylor and her team at Green Analytics did a tremendous job for us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Allison. Jill, next we have Indra Maharjan from Aqua.
Thanks, Dan. Jill, thanks for the great presentation. Quick question was, is wastewater infrastructure included in this whole deal? And if yes, if the answer is yes, like, can you give some insights into what kind of tools is being used to assist like a HICC for wastewater infrastructure?
Water and wastewater is included, but we have, because I'm not directly connected with the water utility, I speak about it kind of in a very small sense. The tools that we are using, the climate risk and resilience assessments, we're working to roll that out with some of the water projects. We haven't yet used it with them. They have a slightly different process and a different set of, well, I would say a pretty strong set of stress testing processes that they go through. So we absolutely recognize the water and wastewater connections with climate change, but we, to this point, they have needed perhaps less support. So we haven't provided quite as much to those groups. But yeah, there's absolutely a lot of learnings between our groups that happen all the time.
Yeah, and then in our utility, I'm leading that and going through similar experience like you. Think that the assumption is there's not a lot of footprint in those facilities, and our experience is just opposite. There's a lot of footprint. Obviously, it's a little bit complicated as an infrastructure and the function of the infrastructure itself. So I'd be very stay tuned on what you or how you roll out, because at this phase we are just kind of juggling the ball, like which tool is better, which tool gives us a good insights and information. And obviously we are very cautious of not adding a lot of work for operations team. Obviously they're very busy, short-staffed and all those. So yeah, please keep us in the loop. I would be really looking forward to see how it works out on Calgary side of the things. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Catherine.
Yeah, maybe a quick question or maybe something we can discuss online or offline, but just wondering about like your climate risk index and your urban heat island effect. Is there certain specific tools that you use to do that, or is it you kind of built it yourself with your geodatabase team? Just wondering for transferability for other cities or potentially other smaller cities, like what can other people learn and sort of emulate from all the great work you've done?
Yeah, we've had a lot of consultant support with all of that. The Climate Risk and Resilience Index was put together by WSP originally. And so we're going through a process now to take what they had done and sort of just put it into our own format so we can share it outwards. The methodology behind how the sort of risk assessment was conducted in there, it's something that we've seen different iterations of across the country and kind of across North America. And I think it's certainly a growing field and how that can be done and what you look at and how to put the pieces together. I certainly feel like as we worked on that with WSP, probably, I guess 2 years ago, we would have started it. There was a lot of, well, let's try it this way, let's try it that way. As so much of adaptation really, I think, has been in the past 5 years, just trying to develop processes and steps and tools that make sense. And then the urban heat island map, that was a project completed through a Microsoft for Earth grant. So it was actually a bit of a test pilot project run. The work was completed by Gramener, a computer science group in India, actually. And so the analysis going from LiDAR to the urban form and shape, they did a lot. I don't understand it. I was not in the depths of the methodology. And what I know our group now is doing is kind of taking the analysis that they did and putting it into our own framework so that we have it within our own system. The urban heat stuff is confusing and it's complicated. I think there's some challenges. One thing I will say, because of LiDAR, is it took roof level readings, and we have not to this point done any type of on the ground readings. So where we saw that really kind of give strange results was to our downtown core, where the roof level is quite different than ground level. We have a reasonably small downtown compared to some of the major cities in Canada, but we had some sort of strange outputs through that area. So it's certainly not a perfect system yet. Ideally, I think you would try and layer your LiDAR information with ground level information, but it's not a smooth correlation either. We've been working, because this came through Microsoft for Earth, there've kind of been some ongoing workshops with it. And we've been working with NASA and all these really brilliant scientists out of the US. And yeah, I'm not a computer modeler person, so I really cannot speak. I couldn't try to roll that methodology myself. I have no idea if other municipalities could. I think it's something that the project was supposed to come up with, a bit of a process that could be replicable across Canada and North America, but I don't think we got quite there yet.
No, thanks for sharing, and that adds some insight on the technique and the tools. And it sounds like it's definitely an iterative process, as all adaptation is. Like first do it, and then how do you make it more efficient within your existing systems?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you first do it, and then find out everything you don't know, and then you try and do it again almost. And yeah, we'll get better.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Jill. Unfortunately, we'll have to end it there just to keep everything on time here. And I think there's some more comments and questions in the chat box if you want to check those out.
Will do.
and maybe address those at a later time. And thanks, Twyla, for the comment as well, if people want to check out the chat. Amazing work and many elements that could be explored further. So thank you, Jill. I think each element is resonating with different parts of this audience. So it's really great to see this work, and we'll certainly stay in contact with you and look for updates as you move along. So thank you again, Jill. Great. So we will now move on to another session that we like to hold in most of our IBWG meetings, which is short updates from members of the IBWG. So unfortunately, we only have a little bit of time here because we have to get to the state of play discussion. And obviously, I think you'll sort of discover as Beth and Christine Calhoun speak that there's much more to explore with these speakers. But we'll try to keep this presentation very short, maybe 1 or 2 questions afterwards, and then we'll move on to the state of play discussion. So a brief introduction to our speakers. Beth McMahon is CEO of the Canadian Institute of Planners. Beth has guided the development and implementation of TIP's policies on climate change, healthy communities, reconciliation, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Beth lives on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people near Ottawa, Ontario, with her partner and 2 daughters. Christine Calhoun is a registered professional planner with over 25 years of experience in diverse planning areas, including climate change adaptation and mitigation, asset management, natural assets, land use and community planning, renewable energy, and community safety planning. Christine has been a researcher and lecturer with Simon Fraser University since 2017. So I will pass it over to Beth and Christine.
Thanks, Dan. I'm very aware of time, and I know Christine's going to share her screen
right now.
Well, she's just doing that. I'll just let you know that CIP, we are the National Association of Professional Planners, and we've got about 8,000 members. We just broke that milestone number in the last month. So we're very proud of that. So our members include professional planners, including Christine, aspiring planners, planning students, and people who have an interest in planning. So we're very proud of our inclusive membership. And this project we're also very proud of. It's been a work in progress for many, many years, which I will let Christine tell you about because she has been involved since the beginning of that. So thanks for having us.
Thank you, Beth. Great pleasure to be here, folks. So my task is to just briefly give a high-level look into the Federal Land Use Guide for Flood Risk Areas. And so basically, I just held the final pen, and it's in the press right now, so it's coming out shortly. It's being translated. And the idea behind it, if you could focus in on the fact that it's to give confidence and permission to register professional planners to bring in a hazard lens, which is specific to flood. So with that, and I write these decks because it's a takeaway. It's not because I want to, if you just want a high level view, here it is. So a community achieves an elevated level of resilience when its risks are strategically and proactively managed. It is adequately prepared for known and potential disaster events, and it demonstrates an ability to swiftly recover after each of the events have taken place. So to achieve an elevated level of resilience, a community's registered professional planners must first understand these risks and ensure their capacity to manage those risks within their professional purview. So again, so that's a trigger right there. Planners, if you don't know, please go get those tools, and there's lots of learning out there available. So that's the step number 1 in writing that one. Establishing a national approach, which is absolutely needed to manage flood risk strategically and proactively by way of land use planning, is intended to facilitate a common national best practice and increase the sharing and use of flood risk mitigation and management information, which we don't do yet, which would be lovely if we could, thereby improving the foundation from which further flood mitigation and management efforts can be initiated. So this guide emphasizes and articulates the role of land use planning and is intended to support practitioners to advocate for and practice risk-informed land use planning for flood risk mitigation and management. Because Going to the bottom box, flooding is an increasingly significant consideration in land use planning. Land use planning is one of the most effective land development junctures for managing risks and reducing loss of lives and property, as land use management planning is the precursor to all human development. So planners, RPPs, are the precursor to all human development. We need to be informed, bringing in the necessary lenses, because our plans need to enable and support community resiliency. So always ask yourself, if the planner is not at the table, know that we can impede good initiatives just by way of the fact that we don't know about them. More specifically, land use planning is the process of developing and implementing plans that inform and guide the way communities strategically develop over time. So again, it's about permission and confidence. So the guide defines watersheds and governance, right? So it just defrags it so that we all have a common understanding and a common language, so shared understanding. Defining the professional role of the land use planner, so that we all as RPPs, registered professional planners, understand that this is our role. We're giving permission. We are saying, yes, that is your role. Please don't hand it off to the engineers. Defining the types of floods and flood risk assessment. So just defragging it. What do you mean when we're talking about this? So they have some comfort when they come to the table. Articulating the role of the planning professional in mitigating and managing for flood risks by way of land use planning tools in the context of the flood mapping framework. So this is number 9 of 10 guides related to flooding at the national level. So again, land use, so planners, and I get that a lot of folks go, well, we don't have community planning. We have, so it's called different things in different provinces. So in BC, it's the official community plan, it's zoning bylaws. So without all those, development doesn't go forward. So we have to bring in the hazard lens, the risk lens, the climate lens, in order to enable and support community resiliency. And this guide goes a long way in doing that. But again, it's all about confidence in the RPP to do so and permission to do so. Because often at the local government level, planners, despite good plans, despite thorough engagement and bringing forward to council, but if council doesn't understand or has ulterior motives, often development, they can be thwarted. So what we're doing is to empower the planner to enable and support community resiliency. And it's coming out soon, folks.
Great, thank you, Beth and Christine, for a very brief presentation. Obviously, there's a lot more to go into here. If there's any questions, please raise your hand. We have just about 2 minutes. And while we're waiting for questions, I have a question for maybe both Beth and Christine. So first of all, it's great to see this guide. I went through a planning program at UT now 10 years ago. And when I was there was no mention of hazards, very little mention of climate change. And as resources like this come online and you see a need to educate planners about their role in managing hazards in this way, as you said, like shouldn't be passed off to engineers as part of their job. Do you find that this is being integrated more into curriculum in planning programs, or are you promoting its integration in any way?
Well, as it happens, Dan, I did make a pitch here at UNBC, University of Northern British Columbia, and I've already done a lecture to third-year planners, planning students, and I'm making the pitch to the other professors. They're all giving me the audience so that I can come in and talk about this, provide as a guest lecture. As well, Beth has invited me to give a webinar in the new year about this guide. And of course, I will be inserting other things. And really, I agree, Dan. When I went through planning school, well, we didn't talk about risk, right? The risk layer, the risk lens, risk assessment. We did, and despite the fact that flooding is the most significant issue across Canada from a cost perspective, we don't talk about the fact that humans build in floodplains, right? Humans build by water. We always have. We settle there. And the fact that once you bring in that risk lens, the risk and hazard lens, you'll find that less development would occur. Or at the very least, it would bring, as City of Calgary had mentioned, the adaptation layer, right? So only certain land uses can be built in certain areas because they're higher hazard areas. And I mean, a hazard is just a hazard, right? It happens. The folly of humans is that we tend to build in these hazard areas, right?
If I could very quickly just let you know too that we're actually undergoing a review of professional competencies within Canada. And part of that process is because we need to put in place requirements around climate resilience as well as reconciliation. So that would influence to accredited planning program curriculum.
That's beautiful, Beth.
Great, thanks. Joanna, if you can squeeze a question in a couple of seconds. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as part of work we're doing on using natural infrastructure at the watershed scale, we've done a review of watershed management across all the southern Canadian provinces, which is where most of people living in Canadian are. So that might be useful to you guys, because I guess planners have their work cut out in a different way, depending on which province they're in, because it's so different. So I just wanted to just highlight that. I think that the final publication will be something like February or March probably, but I can perhaps give you when I've got a draft, I can perhaps let you have a look at that section.
That would be awesome, sister. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joanna, and thanks, Beth and Christine. Obviously, there's more to talk about here, so we'll stay in contact and maybe find some more time for you in this group in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Great, thanks. And I will pass it back to Catherine.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the great quick update. So our next is a longer presentation, and we'll have some time within that presentation for comments and questions and discussion, and again, encouraging you to put things in the chat box. So as many of you are aware, Infrastructure Canada is working with WSP, previously Wood, and CBC to update this Infrastructure and Buildings Working Group State of Play report. First published in 2017, and so now we're updating it with the progress as well as the gaps and certain key case studies to help people sort of do that peer over the fence type of learning, then they can replicate the success stories in their own area. So today we're lucky to have 3 members of the team that are working on this. So we've got Leanna Augustin and Peter Nimrichter from WSP and Christine Zimmer from CVC. So I'll turn it over to the 3 of you to go through the presentation and sort of the call for input from this group that we have here today.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. This is really exciting to be able to introduce you all to what we've been working on in terms of this updated state of play report and what we've heard from the experts so far. Peter, do you want to give a brief introduction before we go through the slides?
Sure, and I'll ask the same of Christine Zimmer if she'd like to make some comments. We were tasked the same team essentially in 2016 by the IBWG and Natural Resources Canada to look at the state of adaptation to climate change across Canada, develop, look at the state of things, see where the gaps are, see where we were doing things well. We developed, I think, if I remember the number right, something around 60 considerations for future action that help to inform the continuing work of the IBWG. And we are here now, 5 years later, to take another look at where we have come in those 5 years, really focusing on the recommendations that were made in 2017, how those things have advanced, not advanced, stalled, what needs help to move forward, where do we still have gaps, where do we still have barriers, those sorts of thoughts. And we have had a program of engaging with various experts, individuals and groups across the country over the past, I'd say, 6 or 7 weeks to gather information. And what Leanna is going to go through today is really a summary of what we heard through those conversations. So Christine, do you want to add to that?
Just that, Peter, I think you did a great summary, and I think the 2 presentations or 3 that were done just before us really kind of highlight the progress that has been made since 2017, which is great. And I think that, again, a lot of good examples we can draw upon for the report. What we really are hoping is, as we go through the presentation and we talk about key summary, what we heard, we'd really love to we'd like to get from you in the chat box your thoughts on sort of, yes, you agree, no, you don't. If there's case studies that you have, that would be great. Or you have suggestions or recommendations. We will be sending this presentation out to you as well. So feel free again to, send us comments and help us to refine and support. We will be from this developing an analysis and a report based on not just the expert engagement that we've had, but also sort of our lit review and discussions. So that'll be pulled into a larger report. So with that, I will turn it over to Leanna.
Thank you, Christine and Peter. So yeah, for our agenda today, we did the introduction. We're also gonna just briefly again go through what we're looking to get from you all today. We're gonna look at the interview and survey format that we used for this engagement, who we heard from, and then also going to go through some of the key themes that we found across the groups that we interviewed, and then looking at next steps for this updated state of play report. So I think Peter very exquisitely went through this introduction, but I do just want to lay out the 4 aspects that we focused on for our interviews and our surveys. So the first one was looking at advancements that's been made since 2017 in the realm of infrastructure adaptation. So looking at new knowledge and tools, developments in policies and standards and best practices and innovations. We also looked at the challenges that organizations have been met with in terms of adaptation, as well as existing gaps and barriers that still need to be addressed. And then also looking at some tools that these experts thought that would be helpful in terms of being able to move past these gaps and be able to advance adaptation efforts. So yeah, in terms of what we are looking for from you, when we're going through the key themes that we found across these groups, if you see any other gaps that haven't been addressed or any other progress in terms of case studies or programs or policies and so on, if you could put that in the chat function, that'd be great. And yeah, we'll be sending these slide decks after the presentation as well, so you can also do it that way. So for the interview and survey formats, we did 19-hour-long interviews between September 6th to October 12th. So this included 6 group interviews and 13 individual interviews for a total of 32 experts that were interviewed. We also did 4 different surveys across 4 main themes of infrastructure adaptation. So we sent this to 20 experts that specialize in one of those 4 areas. However, we only got 3 responses from these surveys. So these responses have been integrated into what we found from the interviews. So who we heard from, we talked to a lot of different departments in terms of government departments. So from the federal to the provincial to the municipal. We also talked to 2 people from the transportation ministry, as well as a variety of different industry groups, building groups, and nonprofit organizations and research centers. And then moving on to the first theme that we found throughout these interviews and the surveys was the lack of funding for shovel-worthy projects rather than shovel-ready projects. So there seems to be limited funding for these proactive or innovative infrastructures that require a higher upfront cost. And the tendency for funding seems to focus on reactive infrastructure or replacing like for like once infrastructure is destroyed from climate events. There also seems to be limited funding for whole project life cycles rather than looking at just one aspect of a project life cycle. And Jill communicated this really well as the challenge in communicating the return on investment associated with this proactive adaptation infrastructure, as well as communicating the cost of inaction for not implementing proactive infrastructure. There was also discussed the misaligned distribution of short-term costs and long-term benefits, and the fact that voluntary building codes often takes time and involves a high upfront cost, and developers often have to go through a lot of hoops to be able to implement these voluntary building codes. And the limited capacity for holistic adaptation initiatives that incorporate a social equity lens. So it all kind of goes back to this lack of funding for more holistic and innovative infrastructure adaptation efforts. We did want to highlight some examples that we found from the interviews for some existing shovel-worthy projects. So as Jill communicated, the City of Calgary Climate Strategy is a great example of this. EPCOR's SERP Community Flood Protection Program as well, and the BC Climate Preparedness and Adaptation Strategy. So we provide the links here. So once we send the slide decks over, you can be able to check those out. So the second theme was the challenge in uptake and implementation of standards. So one of the main advancements that has been made since 2017 was the development of federal standards and policies that require a climate lens to be taken into consideration within building designs. So the Infrastructure Canada's Climate Lens is a great example of this, as well as NRC's Climate Resilience Built Environment Initiative. There's also some provincial standards that have been developed, such as the 2015 Technical Circular that also requires this climate lens to be taken into consideration. The gap that still exists, however, is the challenge in uptake of these standards. So be able to provide tangible and context-specific solutions to designers to be able to actually implement this on the ground. One of the suggested tools to be able to help with this was having a portal that provides a set of possible solutions that are industry specific and provide an adaptation ROI. The second gap is the rigorous process of both developing standards and implementing these standards into building codes. One of the suggested tools was professional training programs, particularly in terms of implementing this on the ground to be able to have designers actually be able to understand how to have the solutions that are context specific for their industry. The last gap is that guidance documents do not keep up with standards. For example, for future floodplains, this is a main challenge. And then the suggested tool for that was having a data flood maps, such as the one that Newfoundland uses for their floodplains. This could possibly be used as an example for other provinces to adapt. And then the third theme is the convoluted roles and responsibilities. So this has led to a lack of harmonization and coordination of these roles and responsibilities, both between and within government entities and non-government organizations. And one interviewee actually put it really well. He said that there's all these different dots that have been implemented. So different standards and more climate data and all these different programs and initiatives, but there's nothing that's actually connecting these dots to one another. So that's led to a lot of these departments working in isolation and slowing the progress in terms of collaboration. There's also disconnect in federal standard development and provincial code implementation at the regional level. So for example, NRC is responsible for developing national model codes, which are not in regulation until they're adopted by provinces and territories. There's a little bit of a disconnect there. And also the lack of collaboration between federal, provincial, and Indigenous entities that limits the ability for a grounded and holistic understanding of what Indigenous communities need. One of the tools that was suggested by, I think it was just one participant, there was the idea of having a singular government entity that guides and coordinates adaptation roles and responsibilities. This was a tough one in terms of finding a tool that could actually help with this, but I thought this was an interesting one and something to consider. And one of the progresses that's been made in this realm is the Peel Climate Change Partnership. I think Christine had put a link to this in the chat previously, but this is an example of a collaboration between different organizations for flooding to be able to work together and come up with solutions. So I'm sure there's other examples that we can maybe discuss, but that's one of them. The fourth theme is the increased recognition and public support for adaptation initiatives. A lot of the interviewees contribute this to the recent severe weather events, such as the BC atmospheric river events. Also, the Hurricane Fiona that's currently happening could also drive some more recognition of this. And this has driven funding opportunities and access to climate data for provinces and municipalities, which has also driven the development of programs and strategies. For example, the BC Climate Change Adaptation Strategy and the Intact Center program that looks at 15 things that people can do in terms of infrastructure adaptation. One of the gaps, however, is that there's a misunderstanding between adaptation and mitigation. There's a lack of discussion on adaptation, which leads to little uptake at the ground level. For example, there's not enough inclusion of adaptation in energy audits. And there's this need for public and professional education to increase this incentive. So the next theme is understanding of climate information. So since 2017, there's increase in both the amount of and access to climate data. And an example of one of the advancements within this realm is Engineer and Geoscientist BC's professional practice guidelines and climate change information portal that basically translates climate data information for engineers and geoscientists to be able to implement this on the ground. However, for the most part, there seems to be a disconnect in terms of information not being translated for industry-specific audiences. So this limits the implementation of these standards if they're not able to understand what it actually means. And the second gap is that there's an unequal distribution of climate data in which Indigenous communities don't have access to the same amount and quality of data that provinces and territories have. And this is a major social equity issue, especially since Indigenous communities in the North are arguably the most impacted by climate change. And one of the tools that was suggested by a lot of these participants was having a central portal for information and best practices that have a translation function on it. The next theme is limited capacity for adaptation initiatives. So we put these into 4 different realms. The first one is that there's limited staff to apply for funding and implement standards into designs. The second is there's a lack of formal training on climate adaptation among municipalities and industries. One of the progresses that was highlighted by one of the participants was that there was formalized training supported by Narcan Brace. The third is there's limited professional staff with relevant Indigenous knowledge and relationships to partner with Indigenous communities for adaptation efforts. And the fourth is limited staffing to integrate climate change planning into infrastructure asset management. Then looking at nature-based solutions. So we asked these participants what they thought the level and role of importance that nature-based solutions plays within infrastructure adaptation. And there was some, I don't want to say polarizing, but different perspectives in terms of the level of importance that this plays. But overall, one of the main aspects that people highlighted was that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It really depends on the context where it's being implemented, the region, whether that's a big municipality or a smaller municipality, the type of community where this is being implemented. And that this also needs to be co-developed with great infrastructure for it to be effective. And some of the benefits that were discussed was the relative low cost of implementation of NBS for the most part, the resilient nature of NBS, and the spin-off social equity and health benefits of having nature-based solution adaptation efforts implemented into communities, as well as how useful of a solution this is for Indigenous communities, specifically in terms of how it relates to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values. Some of the gaps of NBS is the lack of clarity, again, around the definition of it in terms of if it's a mitigation or an adaptation initiative. And also that there's the life cycle costing of NBS is not built into federal funding. So it's difficult to be able to gain this funding for this to be implemented. And in terms of next steps, so we're going to submit these slide decks to you guys, and you can gather your feedback on key points in terms of some gaps that you think need to be addressed, tools, as well as any case studies, programs, initiatives that you have that you can send to us. And if we could get this by November 4th, that would be great. And then December 16th, we're going to present the draft state of play report. February 10th will be the final state of play report. And then March 3rd, we'll finalize the communication materials. And that's it for the presentation. And yeah, if you have any questions or we can discuss some of these aspects.
Thanks so much, Leanna.
Anyone have any case studies, or do these gaps resonate with people? Oh, Peter,
feel free to continue adding things to the chat, and also if you want to speak up, feel free to just raise your hand. Go ahead, Arif Hussein.
Yes, thank you very much. It's Arif Hussein from Transport Canada. Thank you so much, WSP, for that very, very informative presentation. I was wondering during your consultations if you heard anything about the role of the National Adaptation Strategy, since that's a pretty significant role that many of us are playing, and that strategy is supposed to be released later this year.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I just wanted to comment briefly. We have had meetings with people from the NAS who are developing the NAS. We've looked at a number of the summary briefs that have been developed by the different working committees. So that information is being integrated into our work.
So it is being integrated into your final report?
Well, I think we've taken and we understand what some of the outcomes and recommendations that are coming out of NAS, and I think what we'll be doing is providing some further refinement or details as to how to address some of the outcomes and goals that they've listed in the 3-year and 10 years, and associated with that are some of those gaps. So in order for you to meet those short-term and longer-term goals, we have to overcome some of these gaps. And here's some of the recommendations to do that. So for instance, we heard across the board, whether it was building or roads or stormwater, that there's a need for tools and a cost benefit. And again, we saw that again with respect to natural-based solutions. There are these great, carrots and sticks, like the standards, like the funding requirements that require you to look at climate change, like some of the provincial guidance that's come out that's directing municipalities to look at climate change amongst their municipal planning and their stormwater master plans, for example. But I think there still is a lack of tools for municipalities on how to actually do that. And so we're going to provide some recommendations with respect to what tools are available and what gaps still exist. And some case studies as to how some municipalities, for instance, may be addressing that, or how private sector may be addressing it. And also some examples. I think Leanna mentioned that, from a mitigation perspective, there's definitely been a lot more discussion around the need for mitigation, less so in the media on sort of adaptation, right? And so are there lessons even from mitigation, like the energy audits that are being done and rebates that could be applied for adaptation measures? Because when you look at it, we already have, in the GTA, roughly 60% of the GTA was built prior to flood control standards. So part of adaptation means going into private property lands and encouraging them to make adaptation measures. And so there's going to be a shift in how we deal with things. It's not just the role of the municipality or the province or the feds. We have to get property owners to make these shifts. And so those are some of the things we'll explore in the report. I hope that helps.
Yes, that helps. I'll just flag here that last year Transport Canada did an adaptation state of play for the transportation sector, and as I was listening to some of the gaps that you identified in this report are quite similar, if not identical, to some of the gaps that were identified in our report, and it's quite reassuring to know that we're working on the same page. So look forward to seeing the final report, and hopefully there will be opportunities to IBWG to help address some of the gaps. Thank you.
Can you please share that report? That'd be great.
I will talk to my colleagues.
Okay.
And I will get back to you,
okay.
Christine. Will do.
Sounds
Thank
great.
You.
I see 2 hands up. Can we go with, I'm sorry, I don't know who.
Joanna
put their
is,
hands up. Yeah.
Joanna's at the top of my screen. Go ahead, Joanna.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of gaps, like there was a whole bunch of actions that were discussed at both the resilient natural built infrastructure table and the disaster resilience table and the nature table as well. So I guess whether they remain gaps just remains what we hear from the launch of the National Adaptation Strategy as to what actions have been taken on board and what actions have not been taken on board. So that would be, I think, key to the report. I just wanted to also flag the National Infrastructure Assessment, which I kind of got quite excited about when it was announced, but it hasn't, got off the ground yet. But climate resilience should be a key part of that. I just wanted to flag there is a new report as well out on planning for infrastructure success, which might actually be a good read for the team putting the state of play report together, because that gathered a lot of similar thoughts about where our gaps are.
Thanks, Joanna. And if you could kindly send those reports to us, I think that'd be great. I think, one of the, interesting things for Peter and I, because we did the 2017, is to see how much progress there has been made. So we talked about, Infrastructure Canada's climate change lens, but there's also been great progress at the provincial level. I can speak from a perspective of Ontario, and OREG 588 is requiring municipalities to do life cycle asset management costs. It's encouraging municipalities to bring in natural assets. And the provincial policy statement also talks about the need for climate change risk assessments and to take a watershed approach. So I think those are all great moves. The problem that we're seeing is now at the ground level, what are the tools that municipalities, small, medium, and large have? And then the integration needs across different departments and divisions and having the right tools to communicate. So an engineer needs to be able to communicate to emergency management, to planning, to parks people, and we need to integrate. And so budgets also need to integrate. Sometimes that can be a challenge. So those are some of the things we'll be exploring. So thank you, Joanna. If you could kindly send those reports, that'd be great. Kala, if I pronounce your name properly.
Yes, it is. Thanks. So recognizing that we'll have a chance to look at the slides, so I can provide more details later, but just wanting to highlight the fact that under theme 2, SCC's standards to support resilience and infrastructure program is directly responding to the gap, part of that, at least that gap being highlighted.
Yeah, we can definitely add those details. I think we'd highlighted the Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative. We should have highlighted the SRIP standards work as well, but we'll make sure that's in the final report. Thanks, Kala.
Are there any other thoughts or comments? Joanna, I see your hand still up. Is that more, do you have more thoughts or legacy hand?
Legacy hand, sorry.
Okay.
I do have more thoughts. I'm just writing them in the chat.
I'm like that too. Any other thoughts or comments? I'm glad to hear people are resonating with these gaps. you know, and also coming up with some solutions. So I think that's great. And we will try to bring and marry some of these different initiatives like the NAS and others into this report to show the interconnections. So thank you for raising those points. Are there any other comments, or Peter, did you want to?
No, it's I've just been as people have been mentioning things, I've been downloading reports in the background just
Okay,
to make sure I
perfect.
could.
Okay.
But it's been great, all the comments, and you know, as we generally see a lot of the themes, whether it be you know, gaps or advances, you know, we need to really be very positive about the advances that we're making, you know, use those as springboards to try and bring some of these other thoughts that have been reflected through the conversations we've had, these tools, processes, procedures, initiatives that people believe will help us get past some of these gaps that are still out there, that are really representing, you know, significant barriers to us moving forward in a very, very significant way. We've done lots of great work, but I think there's still lots of great work that still needs to happen.
So I noticed Christine's comment about financial accounting, and that's one of the things we found in the Peel Climate Change Partnership, is that we had some back-to-back events, but we didn't have a great financial accounting, full accounting of the damages. And that led to us not being able to show the return on investment for adaptation. And you may recall RBC Blue Water did Canadian surveys, and they said that something like 60% of Canadians felt that municipalities had, you know, had the infrastructure for stormwater was sufficient. So it's very difficult for municipalities to get buy-in for increasing taxes or stormwater rates if ratepayers and taxpayers feel that stormwater infrastructure is sufficient. When in fact, you know, like I said, 60% of urban areas in the GTA were built prior to flood control. So there is a need not just to look at climate change, but to look at the standards that we have and the capacity that we have today. So as a result, we built the risk and return investment tool to allow us to do a full cost recovery of our, not just flooding and not just looking at private and public, but also looking at erosion damages. In some cases, we found erosion damages to be significant. We also found that there's a need to distinguish between the types of flooding, because that'll drive where you do your flooding. So in Ontario, we do floodplain management. You see the importance of planning and removing people from the floodplain. Our biggest threat in Ontario is urban flooding, and emerging threat is groundwater flooding, so basement flooding due to high groundwater. And so creating planning policies for high groundwater was one thing, but also looking at the types of solutions. So you wouldn't want to put in low impact development infiltration techniques where you have high groundwater, right? And so being able to have a tool that's allowed us to understand where our risks are and relative risks has been really important, because in some areas we actually found that high groundwater was more of a threat than riverine or urban, which totally blew people away, because no one, to the point of one of the things Leanna had talked about was roles. No one's identified a role or a lead in groundwater flooding, so, or basement flooding due to high groundwater. So I think it's important that we do have tools to make informed decisions, especially now that municipalities are moving to stormwater rates and taxpayer accountability. So again, just some notes for thoughts. Are there any other comments?
See, Christine, you have your hand up. You want to get something in quick so then we can turn it back to Dan to wrap up.
You bet. In terms of the dialogue, I understand how often communities, the electorate, isn't always up to date on what is actually happening on the ground in terms of our built environment and our natural assets. And I find that through the asset management planning process, and more specifically, the levels of service dialogue, if we could be more bold about using that stage of planning to have that dialogue with the community, because when you start bringing up your inventory, your conditions assessment, where things are actually at, and then bring in the projection lens, the community gets a really clear picture about where investment needs to happen and to what degree. And it really aids in the prioritization. Because oftentimes we think that what we need is to invest in this, but based on what, according to whom? This way it brings in some actual structure to that decision-making process, while also enabling the community to better understand where their tax dollars are going.
Okay, I think we'll have to wrap it up. It always feels like these meetings could go on for much more than the time that we have available. We try to keep the meetings below 3 or 4 hours, I think, well, in the interest of keeping people engaged in the sessions. But thanks everyone for amazing presentations. Another great session.